This is a quick, well, hopefully quick video about buildings through time or architecture through time. And the basic premise of this video is, I don't know about you, but when I see old ancient buildings, these marvels of architecture, and they are, it's amazing to look at them, appreciate them, but I don't have a sense of how they relate to each other through time, or how they relate to time itself. So I don't know what came before the pyramids or the Stonehenge. I mean, I might have some idea, I might have a guess, but I don't know, and I don't know how far apart some of these buildings are in time. So the idea was, well, what if we put them on a timeline? Maybe that. Uh, so this is an experiment. I suspect that would give us a deeper appreciation of these beautiful architectures, these buildings, and the same kind of concept. In other uh, timelines, I want to explore things like the origins of say financial systems or governance systems or culture, and religion. Some of the things that we see today, things that are important, how do they resonate through time? I think that can give us a deeper appreciation for how we got to where we are today. So with that, I'm just going to fly through this timeline here. And by the way, you can access it. There's a link below this video where you can access this timeline, and you can do what I'm doing yourself, and just kind of play with the timeline. It can be fascinating. So let me bookend this timeline by talking about where we are today. So we are in 2020, so that's around there somewhere. So right around here at the edge. And then let me fly back through time, the Bronze Age, the Neolithic Age. So let me just keep going back. And okay, so there we go. So this is the start of our timeline in this case, about 300,000 years ago. So that is what we would call the speciation, or that's when the earliest evidence that we find of Homo sapien arriving on the scene. So modern day human. Okay, so, and how do we know that? Well, we have these evidence of these amazing archaeological finds of these skulls. So Jebel Irhoud, in sort of the Moroccan areas of the mountains, we find these skulls. Now, if you look at the skull, you might think, well, this doesn't look very Homo sapien. I mean, you see some really raised brow ridge there, and in fact, the researchers first thought that they were looking at a Neanderthal, not really an example of the Homo sapien. But since then, researchers have figured out that based on further analysis, that this is an example of the earliest example that we can find of a Homo sapien. So that's pretty amazing that we have one from 300,000 years ago. So really old, and that, once again, that's sort of in the Morocco region there. And since then, so in the sort of we're in the middle Paleolithic era, and you can think of that as sort of the Stone Age, kind of a relative of that. And we weren't really farming during this time, and we don't really find evidence of structures, or if you look at this on my timeline, all the ancient examples of architecture are right here, kind of right in this, almost, a little more than 2% or 3% of the entire human Homo sapien existence is where we find our earliest examples of architecture. Before that, we find bones. So bones before bricks, really. And we didn't probably have a lot of architecture going on 100, 200,000 years ago. We had a lot of cave dwellers. So that's why the earliest example of art that we see, and by the way, this timeline is not exhaustive, obviously. There's all kinds of amazing examples of architecture or cave paintings. I just have one here, the Chauvet cave paintings. There are many others. The idea of this is not to be an exhaustive timeline. It's just things that I found interesting. I've kind of put them on a timeline. So the Chauvet paintings in the Upper Paleolithic type of era are 34,000 years ago, so really ancient. And we find them in France, a little south of France is where we find, these are in a cave, um, that we find these paintings. And if you look at the paintings are just absolutely amazing. So in a cave by an artist who was using essentially burnt firewood, charcoal, and drawing these. This artist, him or her, could have been an animator for The Lion King. I mean, let's look at these paintings. These are just amazing, really beautiful examples. Sort of freehand drawing, and also some coloring and some additional detail on these horses. Just amazing stuff. 34,000 years ago. All right, I'm having my coffee as I talk. Okay, so that's amazing. So we find these cave paintings 34,000 years ago. We don't find any, all this time, we don't find any examples of human buildings. I'm sure there were some, especially 20,000 years ago, because at 34,000 years ago, they weren't all cave dwellers. You had relatively fewer were cave dwellers around that time. There were more cave dwellers more than 100,000 years ago, so around this time, than here. Funnily enough, we still have more than 100,000 people living in caves today. I would assume by choice. Okay, so let's see. So the earliest example of human buildings you find is at Göbekli Tepe, and that's an amazing find. So that's about 11,000 years ago that we find this example, and it predates all other known human buildings by almost by 6,000 years. So this is an amazing find. In the last 5 to 10 years, we found uncovered the archaeologists working at sort of the south of Turkey, in the Şanlıurfa region. It's kind of south of Turkey, so southeast of Turkey. And there's a video here that's a really great video. I encourage you to take a look at it. But it's an amazing. I'll just mention a couple of things that I found interesting. So one is that there seem to be really elaborate temples. I mean, this monolith that you see here, that's twice as tall as a human, or maybe even more than that. So it's really tall. These are huge stones, and these are more than 6,000 years before the Stonehenge. And these are this really precise sort of geometric installation. We speculate that they were for a religious sort of spiritual or something like purpose. So there's this sort of spirituality. There's this sort of things that look like temples. There are these beautiful paintings that, well, they're beautifully carved, but some of them appear quite sinister. So there's this carvings of this large bird playing with cut off human heads, for example. So it's quite fascinating. And then during excavation, when they looked at the homes that people lived in, it was fascinating. It seems like it's more of an egalitarian society, that the homes were all similar to each other. We don't really find evidence that there was this sort of this king of the clan or something with this elaborate house, or a priest with far more generously appointed home than the others. We find that pretty much everyone lived in similar sort of situation. So that's also something that's interesting. The last thing I'll mention is Göbekli Tepe is right at the start of the Neolithic age. So Neolithic is when we start to look at nomadic tribes becoming more humanity discovering agriculture and discovering farming, beginning to settle down and stop being sort of these nomadic tribes. So it's right at the start of that boundary. So that makes it really interesting. Okay, so Göbekli Tepe is an amazing find. And before Göbekli Tepe, we thought that the earliest example of human sort of houses or living was quite possibly the Nap of Hawar. So the Tumulus of Bujon is sort of predates it, but it's more of a sort of a burial place, I would imagine, than sort of a living quarter. the Napa Howard is this amazing place. So this is like north of Scotland, and look at where it is. It's like that this island right at the edge. You know how people got there and lived there. 6,000 years ago is pretty amazing. I'd have a tough time going there today. You have to take yeah, it's quite a trip to get there. It's not easy. Um, so you have these amazing sort of loose stone based buildings that you see at the Napa Howard that still stand, and they have a living area. They have we speculate some sort of spiritual sort of area as well there. So that's quite fascinating, and that predates the Stonehenge, the pyramids. There's these other examples, for example, the megalithic temples of Malta, really beautiful carvings there, 5,000 years ago. And then we see the big one, the pyramids of Giza. So they're about 4,500 years ago. So amazing. When you look at the scale of these things, and you look at, for the longest time after, the Roman Colosseum was sort of 2,000 years after the pyramids. Okay, and while say the Pantheon and the Roman Colosseum is just amazing examples of architecture, look at the pyramid of Giza. It's just kind of literally head and shoulders above what we see elsewhere. So it's really advanced at the time, really example of sort of intimidating architecture. We also have Mohenjo-daro around that time, so 4,500. This is something I didn't know. So I grew up in that part of the world, and we thought that Mohenjo-daro was really old, but it's kind of fascinating for me to see that Mohenjo-daro was essentially coincident with the Egyptian civilization. So the Indus Valley civilization and the Egyptian civilization were more or less contemporaries. And so Mohenjo-daro, we see these beautiful structures with sort of the temple there as well. And then more recently, so there's a gap of almost 2,000 years between those civilizations and say the classical architecture, the Roman and the Greek. So the Greek, we have the Parthenon, this beautiful building, and we can't believe it still stands. These beautiful columns, 2,500 years ago, it survived World War bombing. So it's just this beautiful place. These columns. This is classical architecture is what resonates all the way through today, even. We will see, places like the White House and other buildings in modern times that kind of have these pillars and this sort of facade that's kind of visible. We have other examples. So in India, we see the Sanchi Stupa, this beautiful building, a religious site, these carvings, roughly 2,000 years ago. And we see the Roman Colosseum. The Roman Colosseum is amazing. Almost 2,000 years ago, just this massive building. I mean, the architecture was really amazing to be able to construct that. So this is really the apex of architectural know-how at the time. And I'm not going to go through all of these, but I'll just mention maybe one or two things before I can wrap up here. So when you see the buildings that are spread far apart, for example, say from the Roman Colosseum all the way to the Blue Mosque, this beautiful building. I mean, it's quite stunning. But you can sort of imagine, see the Tower of London, more than 1,000 years after, say, the Colosseum. So you can sort of imagine that, okay, I can sort of guess that the Tower of London comes from an architectural pedigree that finds itself in sort of the Roman Colosseum and the Pantheon and the Petra, even the Petra, about 2,000, you can see that sort of Greek columns and the facade there. You can kind of see the connection, you can kind of see the links. But so those are separated by 1,000 years. So these here are separated by 400 years, things like, say, the Great Wall of China. Now, the Great Wall of China is actually far older, but the one that structure that you see when you visit it today, the big sort of wall, that's more recent. That's more like 400 years ago. So you can kind of see the architectural techniques, but then and these are separated by 1,000 years. But when you go 400 years forward from 1600 to today, you see a big change from, say, the electricity. So we have electricity, we have reinforced concrete happening around the 1800, 1890, around that time frame. And then you see buildings that you just don't connect. So, for example, the Sydney Opera House, this just beautiful building, and then you see this uh, like Burj Khalifa. I mean, it seems like this is a different civilization that built it. I mean, you look at this structure, you look at the technology that goes into it, that goes shoots straight up in the sky. You don't really think that, okay, you go from the Tower of London, and 400 years later, you arrive at the Burj Khalifa, or say the Bird's Nest Stadium. I mean, these appear like alien structures, and that's fascinating when you see sort of this. I suspect what's happening is that with key technologies like electricity and reinforced concrete and some of the building technologies that we have, computational aided design, we are seeing this sort of exponential uh, change in the way we construct buildings, the way we think of living spaces, and I'm totally excited to imagine how things might look like 400 years from now. I think my situation is like 400 years from now, the buildings that we are building will look like a different civilization built them from things like, say, the Burj Khalifa. So they would be so advanced and so different, assuming we don't destroy ourselves first, of course. So, so yeah, so there we go. We have these amazing examples of architecture. Most of the stuff we see is out here. This timeline kind of gives us a sense of putting things in their place, and then kind of marveling at how amazing some of the structures really are, like say the pyramids, or say Göbekli Tepe in Turkey. That's sort of 11,000 years ago. We see these structures and these sort of megaliths there. Um, okay, so till next time, thank you for watching.